Hello, my name is Willard Watson, and I'll be your host today. I'm the Programs and Outreach Director of the Boone Rock Art and History Museum, but right now I'm the resident Doc Watson expert to take you on our journey of deciphering Doc Watson. Arthel Watson, better known as Doc Watson, was born in Deep Gap, North Carolina on March 3rd, 1923. He became an 8-time Grammy Award-winning artist and was best known for playing lightning-fast guitar licks and a rich baritone singing voice. He was one of 11 children born to Jewell and Annie Watson, and the Watson family has deep roots in Watauga County, North Carolina, first settling in the area in the late 18th century. They lacked material wealth when Doc came around, but they were very rich in the traditions of music, of faith, and of folkways. As a young boy in Deep Gap, North Carolina, Doc's only access to music was through his family and the church. So whether they were working or singing hymnals, the family was always singing together. When he was 6 years old, a family friend gave them a Victrola with 78 records. And they included albums by artists like the Carter Family, Jimmy Rogers, and Mississippi John Hurt. These are artists who Doc would emulate their style and perform songs from their collection throughout his life. Growing up, Doc would receive an instrument in the form of a harmonica every Christmas from his father, and when he was 6 years old, his General Watson made his son Doc a fretless banjo with cat skin head. So then shortly after this, Doc left home to go study at the North Carolina School for the Blind in Raleigh, North Carolina. And there, his roommate had a guitar and showed Doc his first few chords on guitar. And it was during his time at the School for the Blind that Doc was exposed to many new types of music, like jazz and classical music. And when Doc returned home for a break, he found out that the family had been given radio from their relative Otis Watson, who went by the nickname Kermit. So Doc would describe in interviews later in life how he could remember the smell of the radio, of the crackling when it would first turn on, and the smell of the tubes when they would warm up, and his love of listening to the Grand Ole Opry and just hearing songs by artists like Bill Monroe and Uncle Dave Macon, and artists like the Mississippi Sheiks or the Delmore Brothers, and being able to listen to these live radio performances from around the country just made Doc fall in love with music. So around this time, Doc decided he wasn't going to go back to the School for the Blind, and he was at home, and he was fiddling around on a relative's guitar one morning before his father was going to work, and General made a bet with Doc. They said, "Oh, if you can learn how to play a song by the time I get off, I'll buy you a guitar." So General didn't know that Doc had learned a couple chords from his roommate at their School for the Blind. So when Doc spent that whole day learning the song "When the Roses Bloom in Dixieland," which there's a link to that recording, or there's a link to a recording of that song in the description of the video. So when General got home, he acknowledged that he lost the bet, and he proceeded to buy Doc a $12 Stella guitar from a magazine. And within 6 months of getting that guitar, Doc's older brother Lenny purchased his own instrument, and the two of them learned a bunch of songs and worked out 2-part harmonies, and would play songs by the Carter family, the Monroe brothers, and the Delmore brothers. And that really provided a wealth of material for the two of them, and a nice foundation of songs for Doc as a growing artist. And these were songs that he would continue to play throughout his life and would record throughout his career. So the earliest known recording we have of Doc playing is from 1943, and it was made by folklorist Doc Abrams. So Doc Abrams was a professor of folklore at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, and he was attending a fiddler's convention. And he made a recording of a person who he noted as Blind Boy Watson. And he had his acetate recorder there with him, so he cut a recording of Doc playing the song Precious Jewell by Roy Acuff, which was a popular country song of the time and was released in 1941. So Doc, his first recording is him playing a contemporary country song, not some traditional number that he learned from a family member. So you can see that acetate with special permission at the W.L. Urey Appalachian Collection at ASU, or you can listen to a recording that they made of it on their website, and I've included a link to that song in the show notes. So again, check that out. So in that recording, you're going to hear a much higher voice on Doc than you're used to hearing, but it was around around this time. So Doc was 18 when he made that recording. Well, when he was 21, he married his sweetheart Rosa Carlton, who's the daughter of one of his jam partners, Gaither Carlton, a fiddler who was very influential in Doc's musical development and who would perform with Doc on many albums throughout his life. And you can actually hear recordings of Gaither and Rosalie on the Doc Watson family album, which was a recording made in the early 60s by Ralph Rensler when he came to visit. We'll get to that later. But yeah, so it was around this time Doc's getting married, he's a young man, and he's starting to take music seriously. And would really do what he would call woodshedding and really focusing on refining his skill and refining his craft as an artist. So in 1947, Doc and Rosalie married, and shortly after they had 2 children, Merle and Nancy. And Doc realized that he had to take his music seriously and as a way to provide for his family. So he would busk on the street in Boone, and he also joined a band and based out of East Tennessee. That was a dance band, and they would travel around the region, and they'd play pop and rockabilly and jazz and blues and fiddle tunes. And they played these long sets, like 2-3 hour long dance sets, and Doc was the lead guitarist. And so it was during this time that he figured out how to arrange these complicated fiddle dance tunes like Black Mountain Rag and turn it into a guitar song, and how he could do that without wearing himself out. So he developed these really fast cross-picking techniques and doing sweeps on scales down the neck of the guitar. So he's able to turn this lightning fast flat picking into smooth fiddle licks. And he was doing all this on a gold top Les Paul. So Doc did this for a couple years, playing with the dance band, touring around the area. And then in 1960, everything changed for him. Because a musicologist from New York named Ralph Rensler came to the area to record Clarence Ashley. So Clarence Ashley, or Tom Ashley, had a record deal in the 20s and was famous for recording the song The Cuckoo. He recorded a couple other songs, but that was definitely his song. It's The Cuckoo Bird. And he recorded it under the names Tom Ashley and Clarence Ashley, because back then you got paid per session, right? Well, he didn't do any recording after that. In the Depression, he stopped playing music, started becoming a laborer and everything, and now he's an old man. Well, there was a trend during the folk revival of these musicologists from New York who would go and they'd find these old 78s and then start doing research and find the people that recorded the songs during the 20s and 30s and rediscover them. Some people like Muddy Waters and Mississippi John Hurt and are examples of artists that became rediscovered during the folk revival. But Ralph came down from New York to record Clarence playing the Cuckoo Bird, and Clarence needed a lead guitarist for the sessions, and everybody knew that Doc was the best guitarist around. So Doc shows up to play with his electric guitar, and Ralph is not having it. It's not authentic enough for him, so the session doesn't really go anywhere because Doc doesn't own another guitar, so he has to borrow a guitar to do this recording session. And the story goes that it was after one of these frustrating recording sessions that Ralph and Doc and another friend are in a truck headed back to Boone. Well, Ralph's in the bed of the truck with the banjo trying to play the song Tom Dooley. Tom Dooley is from Western North Carolina. Ralph, the New Yorker, knew it because the band, the Kingston Trio, had recorded a super bland and plain generic version of the song. And so Ralph's trying to play that version of the song. Well, apparently the truck stops, it pulls over the side of the road. Doc walks out of the cab of the truck, gets around to the back of it, takes the banjo, and proceeds to play just an incredible version of Tom Dooley. And it was so enthralling, and Ralph was so amazed that he realized then and there that the talent that the world needed to see was Doc Watson. So Ralph would still promote Clarence Ashley. He was the one that everybody knew, the Cuckoo Bird. So he could get him shows in places like Gerda Folk City or at the Newport Folk Festival. All right, but it was kind of as a way to get Doc in the door. Ralph convinced Doc that people all around the world wanted to hear the traditional songs that Doc grew up playing with his friends and his family, that they weren't so interested in hearing covers of these contemporary songs, of these country and pop numbers that Doc was used to playing. Ralph was presenting an opportunity for Doc to be able to travel the world and provide money for his family, right? It just took a lot of trust on his part as a blind man to get on a bus in Western North Carolina, to ride it up to New York and trust that Ralph was going to have somebody there to meet him at the bus station and take him to his gig. But it worked out. And in 1963, Doc was able to make enough money from performing music that he was no longer eligible for welfare assistance for the blind, and was able to provide for his family out of his own pocket. And it's something he was incredibly proud of. So Ralph Rensler became Doc's longtime friend and manager, and in the beginning of Doc's career, Ralph would program Doc's sets, and he would discourage Doc from playing contemporary tunes or anything that wasn't in the folk tradition. So in the liner notes of Doc Watson, the self-titled album, Ralph Rensler says, Doc Watson could easily enter the field of pop music or jazz, and he would be welcomed by his colleagues. But he chooses to perform folk music, so he is a unique sort of popularizer, a folk professional with rural roots and urban perspective, a performer too distinct to be labeled with a catchphrase. Now I question this statement, because Doc chose to perform folk music only after Ralph convinced him that it was the only way Doc could earn a living. So the self-titled album, Doc Watson, was released in 1964 on Vanguard record labels. It's 35 minutes in length and features 13 tracks, 7 of which are listed as traditional. There's one original on here, which is Doc's guitar. It's an instrumental that Doc wrote, said that he was inspired by watching a couple kittens playing. It's a very fun, playful song. 4 of the songs on the album, it's obvious Doc knew before the folk revival, but he probably learned them from recording. These are Nashville Blues, Sitting on Top of the World, Intoxicated Rat, and Country Blues. And then there's the song St. James Hospital, which is a folk song, but Doc didn't learn it from his family. He actually learned the song from folk artist Pete Seeger. And Pete gave Doc the album American Folk Songs and Ballads. And this is an example of what folk revivalists would do during the early days of the folk revival, where they would give their artists certain songs. They would kind of plant songs on their set list that they thought they should know, they thought they should learn. So then in 1964, Doc's life changed again when his son Merle joined him musically. So in April 1964, Merle learned how to play guitar. Doc was on tour, and Rosa taught Merle his first chords on guitar. Well, by June of that year, Merle was on stage at the Berkeley Folk Festival performing with his father. You know, that's just staggering to think about how intimidating that must have been. So when Merle performed at the Berkeley Folk Festival, he knew the chords G, C, D, E minor, and A minor, right? Well, he was a musical prodigy, because the next year, the album Doc Watson and Son was released on Vanguard Records. It features 14 songs, 8 are credited as traditionals, right? And all the songs, Doc says in the liner notes that he learned before the folk revival. So by 1966, Doc was growing tired of the creative restrictions imposed upon him by Ralph Rinzler, and the folk revival was beginning to die out. So Doc's third album reflects this, and it's called Southbound. It features blues and jazz songs, and a title track which was written by a homesick Merle while he and Doc were out on tour. It even includes a contemporary cover by the folk artist Tom Paxton. And only one song on Southbound is listed as traditional. In addition to the departure from the previous 2 albums, Southbound's title track was written by Merle, and there's also the song Call of the Road, which is a rare lyrical original by Doc, who's more known as an instrumental arranger than a lyricist. So Doc wasn't sure how the audience would take the stylistic change and hoped to address it in the liner notes. He said, "You'll find this album a bit different from those I've previously done, but you'll also find that it's closely related in many ways with the old-time country music. It's sort of the bridge between the old and the new. 2 years ago, my son started to learn how to play guitar, and after playing backup guitar on my second album of traditional American music, Doc Watson and Son, Merle said, 'Dad, let's make another kind of record.' So here it is. I hope this album won't lead you folks to thinking I'm forsaking traditional American music, because I'm not. There'll be another album of good old-time songs and ballads coming early in the fall." And this album is really a great example of that bridge between the old and the new, and this is something that Doc would continue throughout his career. When he really began to think about what genre applied to him, he labeled himself as a traditional plus artist, right? He's bringing that old and that new, right? So then after Southbound's success, Doc and Merle's repertoire expanded even more to include a wider variety of influences, including George Gershwin with the song Summertime, and the Moody Blues with their classic Nights in White Satin. Merle was a huge fan of the Allman Brothers, and you can see him take Dwayne Allman's influence with slide guitar by using a 5/8 socket wrench as a slide. In 1968, Doc went to Nashville and expanded his sound. So from transitioning from this stripped down folk sound, he entered a Nashville studio and came out with Good Deal, Doc Watson in Nashville, and it was released on the Vanguard label. It features Doc playing poker and wearing tons of paisley, and features a big Nashville band with dobro, piano, and drums, and lots of strings. The album features polish of an expensive Nashville studio and the country classics by artists like Roy Acuff, Jimmy Rogers. So Doc and Merle's career was just continuing to grow throughout the 70s. Doc would appear on the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band's album Will the Circle Be Unbroken, which is another one of those bridges of connecting the old and the new with country classic artists like Roy Acuff, like Mother Maybelle Carter, and Merle Travis, and Earl Scruggs, and Doc Watson, with these young artists like the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. And bringing them together, in Doc's performance of Black Mountain Rag and Tennessee Stud just lit the world on fire, and he and Merle began touring just all around the world. They were prolific in their production during this time. I mean, just behind me you can see a small collection of some of the albums they released. They were credited with over 40 albums to their name, and it's just an interesting kind of thing with representation when you look through the covers of how Doc was represented, and also how there are some albums that are Doc Watson, right? Even though Merle Watson with him, there's some albums that are Doc and Merle Watson, right? And then it's just kind of what label they were on. But no matter what the label, what the cover, when you got a Doc and Merle Watson album or you went to one of their concerts, you were going to be treated with just some incredible musicianship, some good authentic music. And no matter the genre, the style, that's what they cared about. It was how good the song was. In 1986, tragedy struck the Watson family, and Merle Watson passed away. And it was actually during the time of Merle's passing, coincidentally, two big things were happening in Doc's life. There was the production of an intimate documentary called Doc and Merle, which I'll include a link to in the description of the show. And then also Doc was recording his first all bluegrass album, Riding the Midnight Train. This is a somber album, and it's kind of a sign of things to come after this album. Is also another one of those bridges, right? Continuing that tradition. Plus, this album features some of the top artists of the newgrass movement and some of the emerging young Americana artists of the time, with Sam Bush on mandolin and Bella Fleck on banjo. Riding the Midnight Train is a classic album, came out on the Sugar Hill record label, and is dedicated to Merle Watson. After Merle's passing, Doc turned inward and began touring less. The albums he produced after that, the 1987 album Portrait and his 1990 album On Praying Ground, which was his first all-gospel album, were very somber and introspective. And for anyone that was close to him, they would say that Merle's passing changed Doc. Well, the end of his recording career saw two of his most unique albums. In 1995, he released Dockabilly, which is a collection of 12 rockabilly classics, featuring songs that Doc performed during his youth in that Tennessee dance band. Songs like Shake, Rattle, and Roll, Walking After Midnight, and Heartbreak Hotel. And it really has what I think is the best cover of all of Doc Watson's albums. Him driving a classic 50s convertible. And then the last studio album Doc released was a collaboration with David Holt. There's a triple disc album called Legacy, which is a reflection on Doc's life and career. It features interviews, stories, and songs from Doc's life. After 1995's Legacy, Doc continued to release collaboration albums with other artists and tour extensively. His last public performance was in April, just a month before his passing in May. It was at Merle Fest. So after examining Doc's discography, reading the liner notes, exploring his songbook, which features interviews with Doc about the origins of each song, it's incredibly apparent that he learned a great deal from his family. His father purchased him his first instruments, the harmonicas, made him his first stringed instrument, that cathead banjo, and taught him his first song, the Ramblin' Hobo, and even bought him his first guitar, that $12 Stella. But General wasn't much of a recreational musician. He was more of a church singer, and didn't really teach Doc many songs. There are a few songs that Doc does credit to his father, and those are cornerstones of his repertoire, including Ramblin' Hobo, Shady Grove, The Lone Pilgrim, and Georgie Buck. His father didn't seem to play much around the house, but his mother, Annie Green, would sing all day long. She'd sing to her children while she was washing them or putting them to sleep. She would sing while she was making food or working in the garden. And there are songs that Doc credits to her, like Oh Me Wise, Tom Dooley, and Rovin' on Winter's Night. There's one relative who didn't play music that I think had the largest, albeit indirect, impact on Doc's musical career, and that's his cousin Kermit Watson, who bought the family their first radio. Because with that radio, Doc was able to experience the Grand Ole Opry. He was able to listen to the songs that were coming out that were popular, that the musical innovations that were occurring in his time. Because those 78 records that he was given when he was 6 years old, those were classics from the 20s. Right? They were old songs. They were songs that people were playing around him. It wasn't what was current, the innovation that really inspired Doc and gave him the motivation to woodshed, to practice for hours and hours and hours every day. Because unlike someone who's gifted with sight, he couldn't read a scales chart. He couldn't read tablature. He couldn't read music. He had to teach himself everything by ear. And Kermit gave Doc that opportunity to become enthralled by popular music. Doc would speak at interviews about how he remembers how the radio smelled because of the tubes that were in it when they would heat up and when it turned on, how it crackled when it started, just how important the radio was to him as a blind boy growing up in rural North Carolina and hearing the songs of the Monroe Brothers, of the Delmore Brothers, and of the Grand Ole Opry. There's one other person that I want to include as an influence on Doc, and that's Rosa Watson, his wife. She was a musician as well, but she didn't tour with Doc because she stayed home and took care of the family. They loved each other incredibly. There's an interview that Doc gave and about the song The 12th of Never, which was his favorite love song, and it's a song that appeared on his sets towards the end of his life, and it's a song by a 1950s crooner, but is a song about the love that he had for Rosa Lee. And I made a short video with an interview with Doc about that I'll include in the show notes. So as part of my research, I created a discography of 54 studio albums by Doc Watson for a total of 1,022 tracks. 30 of the 54 albums are official studio releases, while 15 of the albums are live recordings and 9 are collaborations with other artists. Some of my favorite of those collaborations are Doc Watson and Gene Ritchie live at Gertis Folk City, and then Doc and Dog, Doc Watson and David Grisman. Of the 1,022 tracks, there are a bunch of songs that he would play more than once, but there are 652 unique tracks out of that, right? So just over half of them were songs, stories, and folktales. The live albums account for most of the spoken word, stories, and joke tracks. 480 of the 652 tracks were recorded only once, while 172 of those 652 songs were recorded multiple times. So what we're looking at here is that 172 of the 652 songs were recorded multiple times. The songs that were recorded the most in order are Black Mountain Rag at 11 times, Beaumont Rag, Wabash Cannonball, and Tennessee Stud at 9 times, Reuben's Train and Train That Carried My Girl From Town recorded 8 times, and then Shady Grove, Deep River Blues, Doc's Guitar, Ramblin' Hobo, Summertime, Walk On Boy, and Omi Wise were all recorded 7 times each. Now if you take those songs together, you'll have accounted for more recordings than some artists have in their full catalog. But it's very interesting because of those 12 songs, 4 of the songs, Ramblin' Hobo, Doc's Guitar, Beaumont Rag, and Black Mountain Rag, are instrumentals. These are fiddle tunes that he converted to guitar. 4 of the most popular songs, Omi Wise, Black Mountain Rag, Deep River Blues, and Doc's Guitar, all appear on his first album, which I think is pretty cool because it just goes to show how some of the songs from his first album became mainstays in his catalog throughout his career, right? I mean, up until his passing, you could still hear Doc playing Deep River Blues. So if you put those songs on a playlist, you're going to have an incredible playlist. And I did that. So since so many of these songs have been recorded so many times, some of them are different, right? There are different versions. You might have your favorite version, and I encourage you to check them out. But in the link for the video description, I will have a Spotify playlist of my favorite versions of those 12 songs. Doc Watson knew hundreds of songs, played multiple genres, and released dozens of studio albums. I mean, there are few constants in his music besides his rich baritone voice and taste in deeply emotional songs. And the most noticeable thing when listening to his music is that he mainly plays 3 styles on guitar and 2 styles on banjo. So the 3 guitar styles he plays are the Carter style or the Carter scratch, flat picking, and finger picking. So the Carter style, at its simplest, it consists of alternating bass notes with chords, right? So Carter style can be played using a flat pick, but is usually played with letting the thumb pick or strum out the bass note while the index and middle fingers scratch or brush the higher pitch strings of the chord. So then there's flat picking. So Doc often used a flat pick for fast single string solos or for rhythmic chord strumming. And then Doc also would do finger picking, and this is where you use finger picks. There's a thumb pick and a pick that goes on the index finger and the middle finger, and the thumb keeps a steady bass rhythm while the melody is picked out on 2 or 3 higher pitched strings by the index and middle finger. And some people do the ring finger, that's more for kind of classical. Another constant was how Doc played his chords. He never played bar chords. He always used a capo, or what he liked to call a cheater. I think this is a result of his time playing in a dance band where you're playing 20 or 30 minute long versions of fiddle tunes, and bar chords can really strain your hand after holding them for a while, right? It might also be a factor of him being blind. It might be easier just for him to adjust the capo and keep the same chord shapes. It could also be for personal preference. You know, there are certain chord shapes that you make when using a capo that you would have to use a bar chord for without the capo. And then on banjo, Doc played mainly 2 styles, 2-finger and claw hammer. And I haven't found any evidence of him playing a 3-finger scrug style, and I think that's mainly because Merle had that avenue covered when it came to the finger picking on the banjo. So Doc's proficiency in clawhammer banjo can be attributed to growing up in Watauga County, North Carolina, in a family of clawhammer banjo players. And I think his choice of 2-finger banjo playing is either a result of him being blind and it being easier for him to play that way, or more likely for his love of Doc Boggs. So Doc Boggs is one of those musicians that recorded songs in the 20s and then during the Depression had to go back to being a laborer who's a coal miner, and then was rediscovered during the folk revival. And he played 2-finger style, and his song Country Blues appears on Doc's first album, the self-titled Doc Watson album. Classic song. So I think that Doc choosing to play 2-finger banjo style with the thumb and the index finger is because of his love for Doc Boggs. In conclusion, I think it's safe to say that throughout Doc's life, family was of utmost importance to him. And musically, this is represented by 2 of his most frequently recorded songs, Ramblin' Hobo and Oh Me Wise. He learned Ramblin' Hobo from his father, and he learned Oh Me Wise from his mother. And in Doc's repertoire, you can hear many other influences. You can hear the oral tradition he inherited from his family, with the jokes and the stories he would tell on his live albums. You can hear the 78s spinning on that hand-cranked Victrola when he plays Spike Driver's Blues or the Country Blues. And you can hear the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday nights when he lets out one of those Jimmy Rogers yodels. You can hear those Django Reinhardt jazz runs when he's playing Stardust or Sweet Georgia Brown. You hear the blues in songs like Walk On Boy or Mississippi Heavy Water Blues. You can hear crooning pop songs that he sang for Rosa and Twelfth of Never. But more than anything else, when you listen to Doc Watson, you hear soul, you hear his heart, you hear his love of music. He only played songs that elicited feeling within him, and that feeling translates in the recording. So while some people may argue that Doc Watson was a traditional folk artist, I think he was an artist of his own tradition, of the tradition plus, of a tradition of innovation. Doc was a truly American artist by taking bits and pieces from songs that he enjoyed, from being strategic about what he played, when he played, based on who his audience was. But I know personally, when I listen to Doc Watson, I am transported to a different place. I hope you enjoyed this examination of Doc's life and music, and please, I encourage you to subscribe to the Blowing Rock Art and History Museum's YouTube page and comment any questions you may have on the video. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. Thank you for watching.